Good afternoon. I'm here with my guest, poet, creative nonfiction writer, professor, J.D. Scrimgeour. Is that how it's pronounced?
That is. Well done.
Well done. Thank you. And let me read you a brief introduction to Dr. Scrimgeour. He holds a BA and MA from Columbia University and an MFA in poetry and PhD in American literature from Indiana University. He has published a collection of poetry, The Last Miles. That was back in 2005, and most recently he has a new book out. It's sort of a long poem, right?
Or a couple poems.
A couple of poems. Says Territories. And he's also very much involved in the Mass Poetry Festival, and he's written extensively. And he's written extensively about sports. And I read his small book, small memoir, right? Mm-hmm. Spin Moves, about basketball, and his, that's the context of the whole book is about basketball, people he's met, his life. And basketball, he always comes back to the basketball game in the court, right? Mm-hmm. And he served as a coordinator of creative writing at Salem State for several years. In this position, he's not only run writer series, but he's organized special events that include Symposium on Jazz and the Arts, the creative process in writing. And you've actually recorded a CD of music with a composer, which we'll discuss briefly.
Sure.
That you have. And so, welcome. I'm glad you can come here to Poet, Writer. Now, I was going to start off with the question. You formed a collaborative with composer Philip Swanson, and it's sort of titled Confluence, right? Mm-hmm. Tell me about how this started and how the dynamics between a composer and the poet.
Well, I met Phil at some sort of campus event. He's a professor at Salem State as well in the music department.
You just look at me like we're having a conversation.
Oh, okay, sure, all right. And we talked about getting our students together to collaborate on something, and we decided, well, why don't we try it first ourselves to see what happens. And so I gave him a couple pieces of writing, mm-hmm. And he looked them over. Mm-hmm. He got really interested in a mm-hmm. long poem that I wrote called Ogunquit, mm-hmm. and we just started meeting and figuring out. I listened to a CD or two of his of music. He mm-hmm. Had released a couple of CDs of piano music, and we started taking some of his music and attaching it to some of the words. Mm-hmm. He composed some new music, mm-hmm. and I actually didn't compose new words or change much for that, but I did. I did have to sort of figure out the timing of when to come in, when to come out, and we worked together a lot on when we wanted music, when we wanted the music to fade out. So a lot of it was about the sound and rhythm, actually, and pacing.
Okay. Was it difficult collaboration at all? I mean, at times, was it challenging?
Actually, it was incredibly rewarding. I don't think of... When we did a more recent piece, which is another long poem, and that actually was more challenging for me because the poem itself, it's actually a poem that's in Territories, a long poem that tells a family story about something that happened about a century ago in Greece that happened to my ancestors. But the poem on the page, it felt a little too dense to perform, so I actually had to cut, revise, move things around to keep the narrative cleaner and more chronological, and so that it could be appreciated, heard, as opposed to read. Okay.
In your mini memoir, Spin Moves, right? Mm-hmm. You usually love basketball as a focal point for the book. And I interviewed poets recently, Philip Burnham, who talks about baseball and how that's great for poetry. It's poetry of failure, he was talking about. Mm-hmm. And then there was this other guy who used to be the editor of the Republic of Letters. What's his name? Now his name escapes me, but he teaches at BU and he's known for his boxing and writes a lot about
Oh,
boxing
yeah.
also.
Is it Carlo something?
No, he's Persian.
Okay.
Whatever, I can't remember his name, the guy with names. So, I mean, basketball. So, you know, I've talked to these guys, baseball and boxing, and what is it about basketball? I know that, you know, reading the book, there was a lot of language and that you used, a lot of, you know, basketball talk, and there was a sort of rhythm, and it was almost the rhythm aligned with basketball. But tell me about basketball, because I'm not a fan of basketball. But,
Oh, well,
but I like the memoir anyway.
yeah, I think that for me, I'd always kind of been involved in sports. I played baseball and basketball in high school. Although, if you read the memoir, you know I have the record for least amount of points scored for the New Milford varsity basketball team. I'd never.
At least you have a
point.
record, right?
Yeah. So, but I think for me, there's something early on. I kind of attached to the speed of the game. There's a lot of also deception in basketball, which is kind of interesting. That as much as it's about grace and power, it's about setting people up so that you're one step ahead of them. I remember the poet Charles Simic talked about how one time he came to Salem State and he talked about how chess was somehow similar to poetry to him because you are kind of thinking 3 or 4 moves ahead and setting something up. And I'm not sure I call that correlation. There's a correlation there exactly for me in poetry, but I think there is something appealing that the mental and the physical are sort of working at a high level at once in basketball. And when people talk about athletes like Larry Bird or Magic Johnson, those folks who sort of brought basketball to the wider public in the 1980s, they talk about how smart they were and how they were thinking as well as moving.
Now, you mentioned a piece of writing book by McPhee.
John McPhee, yes.
And you were saying that he had a sort of very stilted, very proper, polite language in describing basketball, and you felt that that was lacking because basketball should have, you know, the vernacular, should have the, you know, the evocative words and the. Well, maybe you can expound a bit on that.
Well, sure. I mean, you're actually picking up on a passage that I feel just a little bit embarrassed about now, only because I was such a young Turk at the time and felt like I needed to
do what young Turks do.
Right, exactly. So bring McPhee down a peg, and that is a really good book about basketball. But I do think that I was especially interested at the time in trying to come up with how can language, which has a certain kind of order, especially prose that you're sort of expected to follow, capture the energy and the surprise and the permutations that are available to a basketball player. How do you get the game on the page? And I remember I showed the book to my uncle, who was a basketball player, and after he read it, he said, "You know, I don't think you quite got it either." And he's probably right. I mean, I just think it might need a soundtrack behind it to make it really.
Yeah, but I mean, like I always tell my creative writing students, I say, look, if this girl next to you said, "I just stole your boyfriend," we can say, "Oh, I'm deeply offended. You've offended my honor." You're not going to say that. What are you going to say? You know, and then you're going to be authentic, right? You can't be polite in your writing. You know,
right. And you know, for me, actually, it came down to when I think about it. I really am interested in what you can do with punctuation as a way of sort of showing how the words are going to sound. So the passage that you mentioned, actually, I am using a lot of sentence fragments. I'm using dashes. I'm using
a calm teacher's nightmare, right?
Yeah, right. But I think that those I have a lot of some poets especially. Sometimes they try to get through a whole poem without any punctuation, and for me, it's so valuable to sort of set the pacing and
those pregnant pauses and.
And you know, what a colon, the difference between a colon and a dash, just in terms of the feel of the rhythm and the.
Dash is a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
Now, one of your interests is and one that you practice, creative nonfiction. So, I remember they were saying the new journalism, how, with Tom Wolfe, and
Mm-hmm.
this is it's a new form of journalism. So, I mean, creative nonfiction is relatively new in the term anyway, right? I mean, it's probably been done anyway, but I mean, now they give it a term. So, tell me, what is creative nonfiction?
Oh boy.
I mean, I know it's a big question, but
I think
I mean, you would think, well,
part of it is that it captures so many genres, so
yeah.
it can essentially, I think it, oh boy, there's so many. One way to think about it is it's memoir that might not follow a kind of conventional narrative structure, or it can be about kind of lyrical essays, something sort of like a prose poem. A kind of cynical way of putting it is it's nonfiction where you don't expect to have and don't ask for a fact checker.
Okay.
So,
well, I remember interviewing talking to Malachi McCourt. We had him at the Summer Zoomer's Rice Festival, and he told me a lot of you can't get caught up on facts in memoirs. You got to, you also have to engage the reader. So sometimes exaggeration and creative.
Right. And I think that that's that word creative. It sort of gives folks license to expand the truth. Honestly,
not lie, but
what's that?
Not lie.
Yeah, well, no. Honestly, I'm probably a little old-fashioned that way. That when I think about something being nonfiction, I mean, even though I've sort of published in things called creative nonfiction, I'm pretty careful about indicating to the audience if I'm going to go beyond what I think happened. And some writers don't. Some writers almost deliberately want people in that space, but I kind
You
of
have scruples, huh?
well, that's a nice way of putting it, yeah. Or I'm boring, either way. So.
Now, Charlotte Gordon, who teaches at Endicott, where I teach, said that she believes your work has a common mission statement with Whitman, and you celebrate the common man. Would you agree that you're a Whitman-like? A lot of people claiming they were the new Walt Whitman.
Yeah. Well, that's nice of Charlotte to say that.
Yeah.
You can tell she's a friend of mine. But I think...
but I know Whitman took it all in. And,
right. I mean, there's no way to compare oneself to Whitman, but I think what she's picking up on is that I've always kind of had an interest in my writing and writing about other people. And thinking about poetry that's as interested in the sociological as in the interior and the psychological. And so I've done for example, in Territories, the first half of the book are two long dramatic monologues in the voices that I sort of tapped into that were composites of students that I've known. So I think that's the closest I could get to Whitman. I think maybe there's also kind of interest in a kind of accessibility too.
Yeah, your poems are accessible, but they're not shallow.
Well, thanks. Yeah.
Now, I was reading. Your new book, Territories, which you just touched upon, and it deals with a gay man, right?
Mm-hmm, the first poem.
Yeah, and it's pretty graphic. Where did this come from?
Well,
as far as I know, you're a heterosexual.
Well, that's a good guess. As far as I know, I'm a heterosexual.
Right.
But I think that the simplest answer is I had a student who I knew pretty well. I worked with, and I took a few of the facts of his life, and then I knew other students and things that happened to them, and I sort of integrated them. I think being around the arts, you are aware of and probably have to be kind of sensitive to sexual orientation issues, but it's funny because I would consult with friends of mine who knew more about that life than I do for some of the phrasing and so on. And so
no, I mean it seemed authentic,
Mm-hmm.
very authentic, and so on.
Yeah.
So you did research on it.
Well,
or you talked to people.
I think talking to people, it's informal research, I guess. But really, it would be more, sending it out to people, seeing if it sounded right. I know there were certain words or phrases that I went back and changed, and in fact, right before it came out, I called up this student one more time and said, "There's this one line, and what do you think about the word gay boys instead of queens or something like that? How would this guy say it at this point?"
How was it received by the gay community?
I don't know. I don't know that it's...
Was it reviewed and anything like that? Like the bay windows or anything like that?
No, not that I know of.
Okay.
No, so I don't know. It just came out a month ago.
Oh, okay. So it'd be interesting to see
Yeah.
if there is any reaction.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, it was performed, a couple Salem State students performed these as dramatic monologues under the direction of a Salem State theater professor, Peter Sampieri, and people were compelled by it, and the students did a great job bringing the words to life and making them.
Well, that's the whole thing. I mean, as a poet or fiction, you got to get inside the other person.
Mm-hmm.
You have to sometimes you have to take on the persona of someone, and
Mm-hmm.
you did it very skillfully.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah. I was reading one poem. There's so many good poems, but I always try to concentrate on one. We don't have limited time. But I read After the Fire, and so this woman who is disfigured by a fire, and she almost like I was reading it. She almost had like a Zen-like acceptance of her loss, and. I'm wondering in some way, did she have like a sensibility of a poet, or maybe I'm just stretching it, because she observes the world, accepts what's there, captures the moments, and then goes with the sort of flow.
Right.
Maybe I'm just misreading the poem. This is my interpretation.
No, I think you're probably right. There's an interesting story behind that poem, which is, I really like that poem too.
Yeah.
It's in the voice of a woman who's been horribly scarred by a fire. And bad things continue to happen to her. That her husband leaves her afterward, and so.
So this is a true story?
Well, it's based on a few little facts. Someone in my wife's neighborhood in Kansas City actually went through something like this, and I heard about it because she ended up on Oprah, and she was talking, and my wife was telling me this. She'd heard it through her parents. My wife was telling me this story about this neighbor who all this had happened to, was on Oprah as kind of an example of resilience. And the one line that I remembered that my wife told me was that she said on Oprah, "I want to live."
That was an amazing line.
Yeah, and so from that I constructed the character. I mean, constructed makes it sound so artificial, but the poem came from that. I think the one other thing that probably was a factor at the time was two things that were happening in my life. One was we were about to have our first child, and if you remember, the speaker in that poem sort of talks about imagining having children.
Yeah, the spindly legs. Of
right.
Death and the
right. So I suspected that factored into it, and then at the same time, a good friend of mine, Mary Lane, who appears in the basketball book, a good friend from graduate school, had just found out that her cancer.
Mary, right?
Yes, her cancer had come back, and so I think sort of the thought of the possibilities of not surviving were also sort of coloring the feeling of that poem, I guess, and her stoicism in the face of it might be part of that character too, I think. I'll read that poem later.
Wonderful. It's a wonderful poem.
Yeah.
And in fact, do you have a reading coming up that people can attend or anything for your book?
Wow. I don't. I probably should be scheduling some. So, although we might be doing a little bit more with the poem with the dramatic monologues in the fall.
Okay.
And actually, gosh, I do have one. It's way back in January, and it's out in New York State, so I don't even have the details on that now. So.
Well, I hope you give us an excerpt from your new book for the Somerville News, Lyrical Somerville.
Oh, sure.
And give us a little introduction and to the segment or the book, and we'll put you up there.
Sure.
That'd be great.
Great.
It's fun. I was going to ask you. Oh, yeah. So now I will give you your time to read from your work.
Oh, okay.
Okay. And so whatever you want.
Sure.
And you don't have a website.
I don't. Confluence does.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, like most writers have a website. I mean, I see you have you're on the faculty website, but
Yeah.
you should get a website so people
I
can see
know.
everything in one place.
I probably do need to put it all together.
Yeah, because otherwise it's fragments. You know, you get a little here, you get a little there.
Yeah. No,
I would tell the audience where they could see you, you know, all your work together and where, you know, but
yeah. Well, the Confluence website is not a bad place to start.
And what's that website?
It's Confluence Poetry and Music. If you type that in, it should work.
Okay.
And that also has links to me reading excerpts from the CD on indie feed performance poetry and some other things too.
Very good. Well, why don't you read some of your work from us?
Okay.
Whatever
Sure.
you wish.
Sure. Why don't I start with that After the Fire poem?
Okay.
And it's actually one of the poems that I probably have memorized, but I'll read it. After the fire. I don't mind touching myself. I don't mind the stairs. The doctor's visits, they waste my time. I know I'm doing better, but I don't mind. I didn't mind my husband leaving, not looking at me when he told me. My face is not the face he married. My face is nothing I thought a face could be. My close friend wants me to tell her my nightmares, how I wake sweaty from flames blocking the doorway. But my dreams are of the local pool, the children I'd hoped to have, toothpick bodies running along the deck, a splash in the sun. When my mother visits and helps me, I want to hold her, take her in my arms, as if I could bless her kindness. I tell her not to worry. I want to live. She lets me brush her hair as we watch reruns tell us words we've already heard, and commercials offer all we need to become beautiful.
Good. So read some more for us.
Great.
Good afternoon.
Let's get this off.
My guest,
What?
Just keep going.
Oh, okay. Sure.
creative nonfiction writer.
Sorry.
Why don't I read a poem I always read, which is a poem for a poet who meant a lot to me when I first started writing poetry.
Was your father a poet?
He is a poet,
Yeah.
and he's still around.
He's still around, yeah.
Yeah. He's written about 10 books of poetry now, and it's he's really...
Well, you know, you're like Margaret Young, whose father's a poet over
I know. I
yeah,
talked to
yeah,
Margaret about whether we
yeah.
should do a panel.
I should have
sometime.
asked you about poets and fathers, and that should be an interesting panel discussion.
Oh, yeah. Actually, let me, well, you made me change my mind. Why don't I read a little piece about, from my long poem, Ogunquit, 2 poems about my father.
We got about 7 minutes. So.
Oh, okay. I'll read one section from it.
All right.
And this is toward the end of this poem, but I think it sort of stands alone. What would it be like to not have a poet for a father? To not debate what Stevens was saying about death in the line, "Let be the finale of scene." To not take the bus home from college, go out to eat with him in the diner across from the bus stop, him paying, of course, he still pays, and hand him the thin sheaf of my most recent poems, back when I'd first started writing, eating my cheeseburger and fries, trying not to look at him as he read them almost as hungrily as he eats. His own poems abandon the simple sentence for the halts and surprises of the dash, the indented line. years back, inured with the trends of graduate school, I thought them too plain-spoken, too direct, as if we could do more than convey an epiphany, as if there was more to poetry than loving this world and losing ourselves in it. So, I just come across that earlier today, so why
Okay.
not?
All right.
I'll read a little bit from Territory
Sure.
as a way.
And again, it's about a sort of the hard scrabble. The first poem, anyway, is about a hard scrabble life of a gay man.
Sure, and I'll read the second
Yeah.
section of that,
Yeah.
and then go right into the third section. So there's probably about 10 or so sections, and they're written in a very colloquial style. There is a kind of very loose iambic tetrameter meter, probably, but I didn't obsess about that when I was writing these.
William Collis Williams of the colloquial style, I think.
Well, yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I've become a lot more interested in voice than image and other things in my writing.
Oh, okay.
So that's sort of what all these poems are focusing
Right.
on, I guess.
Okay.
So here's this speaker, and he's sort of revisiting his life, thinking about it, sort of reflecting on it. He mentions Gabe in the first line. Gabe is his first lover, who he had when he was 16. I was thinking about the sting of Gabe's stubble when I walked into the kitchen's harsh light. Mom was there in a Christmassy sweater, green and red and white with blocky reindeer. And before I said anything, she said, "I'll never forget this. I'm going to ask you one question and I want the truth. Are you gay?" I looked at her and thought, here it goes, and said yes. And she threw the toaster at me, and then dishes, mugs, anything she could pull from the cupboards. The cop said I should get some of my stuff and leave. It still kills me that I couldn't take my aquarium. Long gone, she said a week later, during our last phone call. The bruise on my cheek wasn't serious enough to press charges. I didn't want to press charges anyway that night, though, looking back, I kind of wish I had. "Do you have someplace to go?" one cop asked as I stood on the lawn. I could see my mother through the front window, calmly talking to another cop. "Bitch!" I screamed, and the cop with me put one hand on my chest, the other on my shoulder. "That's not going to help things," he said. "Do you have someplace you can go?" I looked at him. I could feel his palm pressed against me. His eyes gave me no sympathy, but no hate. He'd seen this shit before. He drove me to Gabe's place and took my 2 duffel bags out of the trunk, set them on the pavement like a taxi driver, and said, "Okay." And I was standing deep in the Lowell night, shivering outside Gabe's beat-up apartment, my folded paycheck from CVS in my jeans pocket, the only money I had. I was 16.
Thank you very much.